One-time racing biker, motorcycle courier, mechanic, labourer and barman, Vincent McGovern was, like so many men before him, thrown all unknowing into the maw of the family courts in 2007. For 9 years prior to that, he'd been a house husband, 3 children. Unlike most other men in a similar situation, Vincent did not leave the field of battle after his own case was settled. Instead, he joined Families Need Fathers and now runs the Central and North London branches of that charity. I expect he'll tell us something about the work they do. Earlier this year, he published a book, The War on Dads and Children, How to Fight and Win. In it, he tells his own personal story, but he goes far beyond that into his entry into the looking glass world of inverted justice as manifest in the English family courts, as well as anecdotes such as his adventures in the European Parliament. Vincent's position, as I'm sure he will emphasise, is to work towards a system which fulfills the family court's mandatory obligation of putting children's genuine best interests first, a principle which they currently fail woefully to meet. So, Vincent, welcome.
Thank you, Rick. And it's an absolute pleasure to be here, interviewed by yourself and Mike, 2 stalwarts in this community of seeking justice and exposing injustice. So,
to the first question then, Vincent. Before we ask about your own personal story, can we address the issue of what the Central and North London branches of Families Need Fathers do? Can you describe what they do for us?
With pleasure. Obviously, I'm not a spokesperson for the charity. I'm speaking for myself, but in my voluntary capacity as chair of both those branches. Central London branch is the founding branch, founded in 1973, I believe. And until about 2011, it is the only branch in London, and attendees were just over 1,000 a year. Then we set up other branches, and Central London branch is now one of 5, but it's the busiest. And prior to COVID, we had of which that's not 900 people, because it would be repeats. So you'd have an average 2, 3, 4 repeat visits. And North London, which is once a month, Central London is made every Monday, 8 p.m. North London is once a month, and our average is about 15. Average attendance at Central London is about 19 or 20. And our whole focus is, and it's one I'm very strongly putting forward, is that we don't want to know how horrible the system is, how horrible your exes become, how wonderful you are, how wonderful your children are. 2 things we want to focus on are, what's the current situation? So there's sort of 10 minutes of very intense, 8 questions asked to get the attendee. About 80% of attendees are men, about 20%, 15% are female. Some of them are mothers, but most of them would be grandmothers who aren't seeing their children anymore. And we just want to focus on what the situation is and get rid of all the confusion, because the vast majority of people who come to us, particularly initially, are very confused. They cannot believe that this system exists. It completely contradicts every concept they have of justice, child protection, human rights. So you have to get them away from that mindset and into an alternative world. And that is sometimes not easy. And I would say we have about an 80% failure rate. There's only about 20% of the attendees we can really help, because the system is so rigged and they're not capable of taking on board what's necessary to deal with it. Particularly as so many that come to us are unrepresented legally, are accused of the vehicle of convenience, domestic violence, removing them from their children. And I would say a quarter of them, English in London, non-native English speakers. So it's absolutely an impossible mountain to get over. But there's a very good committee around for years, and we do the best we can. And it's better to be doing something than doing nothing.
Yes. Vincent, how many people are assisted by FNF branches annually? And does the charity assist mothers as well as fathers?
I cannot speak for the annual figure, but I know that the helpline, which is excellent, I might add, at one time I remember seeing it dealt with 25,000 calls a year. I remember seeing that figure in the notes for an AGM for Families Need Fathers, and I wouldn't doubt it at all. If you consider that there are about 44 to 48,000 applications to the family court per year, it's no surprise that half of that figure will be looking for help, and that our helpline will be getting it. What you have to understand is that the helpline, and my number is up against the branch, I would say that about 3/4 of the, because they're looking for answers in their previous understanding of justice and logic, and they're in an alternative universe. Do we help mothers? Of course. The majority of mothers who come to us looking for help, which is a small percentage of the overall, are the type of mother who just got outsmarted by a devious dad who thought like a malevolent woman, and she fell into the traps. And this system is like the domino effect. Once the avalanche starts, the system then rocks up behind it. And the one thing I've always seen in common with the mothers who lose, who attend our meetings, is this: too honest to go down the dirty allegations route. But then when they're in trouble, Women's Aid, of course, won't help them or anybody else because they've already been jettisoned by them. Same thing applies to mothers whose children are taken off them with the forced adoptions that used to exist and does exist. Women's Aid, none of those agencies will help those mothers. They're only interested in helping mothers get rid of fathers. That's their modus operandi. And quite often, the fathers who are helping, the best source of support there is their new partner or their sister or their own mother, because he's sometimes so traumatized that you can work through them to get the message through to him. But sadly, most of the women who ring me are grannies. Their son has given up and they want to know how they can gain access. Well, of course, it's virtually impossible when he's not prepared or he's been smashed. So you're looking at overall a bleak field.
Yeah, what a distressing situation all around.
Far too often, indeed.
Yeah, there's so many different questions we could ask. Otherwise, we'll be here for all day, really. Are the courts the best place to resolve these sorts of issues around care of children after parental separation? After all, courts traditionally are about criminals.
The courts are absolutely the best place when they work properly. The civic courts, that is, not the criminal courts. Family law is in the civil court, which means there's no perjury, which is very difficult for people going into the court process to understand. And it's absolutely the worst system when they work improperly. And unfortunately, the welfare of the children, Section 1 of the Children Act 1989, which I absolutely adhere to, virtually every word within that, has been so subverted, many would say perverted, by agencies who are the gateway agencies to the family courts. Because the field I work in is predominantly among the lower waged, the working class. That's not a term that's described about those quite often working the hardest in society and paid the less. And the delays of making an application, for example, the C100 application, child arrangements application, has gone from 11 pages to 18 pages with 4 pages of explanation. It used to be far, far simpler. So you're dealing with a father, generally speaking, whose intellect is greatly reduced by shock, loss, and fear, having to deal with complex paperwork, which is very contradictory to read, because the paragraph you fill in the response to, 2 paragraphs further on, is asked in a different manner. And of course, if you fail, then of course you're meant to go to mediation before you can make an application to family court, which all sounds very well. But the bypass for mediation is domestic violence. And that massive articulated convoy of trucks, propelled by misandry, basically, and total disregard for children's welfare, let alone human rights, is the gateway to the family courts. And it's so broad, and there's so many solicitors on the back of it, harvesting it effectively, because what they will often do is they will assist they will assist the mother who wants to get rid of the father, who's been referred to them to a domestic violence agency, which they're working hand in glove with, to get the injunction at ex parte, means without the father being present in court. And then they have the legal aid ticket. So in that regard, in the current situation, the courts are uniquely disastrous and they desperately need to be reformed. What they need to be done is made to do their job as laid out by Parliament. But there's lack of political pressure. And that is a crime.
Just coming back to the complexity of the form, like C100 and other forms, is that part of the service you provide to your clients?
Oh yes. We ask them. Let's assume we're dealing with a complete newcomer, briefly for a moment. So you get them into the 8 questions we ask to establish the facts of the situation. You do this under the housekeeping, Chatham House rule, no identifiers. If we ask what area you're living in, don't say London, just say Wood Green or Barking, for example, things like that. So you get them into the focus, and many of them have not made an application to court because they've been usually booted from the family home or suddenly barred from seeing their children because the mother's a new boyfriend or whatever. And we tell them about this C100. And nowadays, you look all this up online, Her Majesty Courts Tribunal Service, and they see this phenomenal amount of paperwork and words, and all they want is a simple application. With the realization that if they don't fill it in right, it's likely to be sent back. So you're dealing with 18 pages, which is 4 pages of explanation of how to fill it in.
No one ever reads instructions these days. So.
But the instructions are, I have to say, the instructions are contradictory as well. Now, I know the High Court judge responsible for this C100, and he got his 15-year-old son to proofread it to see that it makes sense. And the 15-year-old son, this High Court judge, a man I strongly dislike, I might add, but that's another story. Now, he's never in my case. This High Court judge decided that if his 15-year-old son could understand that it makes sense of it, there was no problem. We're dealing with a 15-year-old, excellent educated, with probably a far larger vocabulary than 90% of the population already because of his background, education, so on. The test of a press daddy. You contrast that with the vast amounts of working class fathers with poor education quite often, not familiar with these systems, shattered by the impact. It's like asking a person after being hit by a train, excuse me, will you fill in this complex form, please? Oh, and your relation with your children depends on you filling it in properly. I mean, talk about loaded.
Do you encourage people as part of this process to complete a parenting plan, a well thought out parenting plan?
We would if the child is very young and they've had very little contact with them, not because we consider them inadequate parents, but because it satisfies the court, because they're probably going to ask for it anyway. The idea being that the father is normally going to be accused of being coercive and controlling, the usual. So you have to demonstrate that not only are you a good father and a good person, you're prepared to listen and learn to help so you can be a better parent to this child, which is your child, and you're hoping to have minimal contact, maybe starting off at 2 hours a month if the child is under 2 years of age, for example. There's 720 hours in a 30-day month, 748 in a 31-day month. And many fathers come to us haven't even got 2 hours. I mean, it is the society's greatest failings, in my current opinion.
Vincent, one might think that domestic abuse is one thing and childcare arrangements something quite separate, but in the family courts, the two things have become inseparable. Can you take us through the reasons for that?
That is the core of the problem, which you've so neatly addressed or asked. Under the Training of Coercive and Controlling Act, which came in 2015, which I attended as an honorary Welshman, the trainee, Dr. Bianca Jackson, had a series of slides. And the top slide was a picture of a man with a muscular fist coming out of his mouth, smashing a woman in the face. That was a slide that dominated the entire 2 hours training for social workers, police, and domestic violence advocates. And the whole intention there was that with the revisions to legal aid, sentencing and punishment of offenders. Now think of this, LASPO, the method of getting legal aid. Its acronym stands for Legal Aid, Sentencing and Punishment of Offenders. So a father making an application to family court to see his child is already in the offender category, because he's normally being ex parte, removal without notice from the family home, or injunction blocked from seeing his children or seeing the mother. On whatever accusation she wants to make, there's virtually nothing to lure it. High percentage of success, because of course she's assisted by the domestic violence agencies. So the father goes to court, all prepared to, before he comes to us, for example, all prepared to argue the case for his history of looking after the children, his support, financial support, emotional support, his family support, and what he can do moving on. And instead of that, straight away, he's whacked with, you're violent. So you have to demonstrate to the court that you're not violent. You're doing well if you can demonstrate that within 1 year. In the meantime, the child isn't seeing you or has very limited contact with you. So let's say the child is past 3 or 4. The child is suffering a lot of pain by not seeing you. It is not an environment that encourages seeing you or paints you in a positive light, either, I might add. Then when the child does see you, it goes through an awful lot of emotions. I can just imagine, your children, we're all children one time. So you see this man in a very cold, hostile environment. Contact centers, supervised contact, supported contact, perhaps, whatever. And then when you take away from him, you are quite often briefed as to how it went and all the rest. So the child might be talking excitedly about what I did with daddy. That's a disaster, because the next contact session may not happen because the hostile parent does not want the child to have a positive relationship with her man. That's the bottom. It happens with women too, sadly and tragically, but the majority, 93-95% of the time, is with the men. So there's an inextricable link between the promotion, the facilitation of domestic violence and fatherlessness. So the Children Act, far too often in its enactment, is, I often believe, it is a managed separation of fathers from the children by giving them hope at the beginning, because the wording is wonderful, and the reality outcome is quite disastrous, far, far too often. You know, this is primarily a war on poor people. The wealthier off people have both have barristers. These agencies are not involved. They have the resources. They have a couple of houses quite often. In the southeast of England, the vast majority of people are struggling to have one house. Whoever gets the children gets the house. And even if the father's a primary care, he'd be booted out anyway, because he has to prove he's not violent. So it's an inextricable link. It's a disastrous pair. It's a gruesome twosome, I call it.
One issue that obviously arises here is that, in as far as the allegations of domestic abuse are accusations of criminal behaviour, then why should they not be tried in the criminal courts? Would it be better if they were tried in the criminal courts? Would that be a way forward, or would that make things even worse in your view?
You've asked a question that many, many people outside of this system ask me, and it goes to the core of the situation. The vast majority of the allegations wouldn't come near the level necessary for criminal courts, which is why they don't go near the criminal courts. They're in the civil proceedings on the balance of probabilities. Now, the state will say that both parties can argue their case, and on the balance of probabilities, judging by demeanor, behavior, statements, the learned judge will make a King Solomon wisdom decision. The mother at most of the fathers I'm working with will already have legal aid. She already has domestic violence agencies. She already has social workers. She has a school effectively, right? And she probably offers the GP surgery as well. And the father will be subject to allegations, which will end up being NFA 95% of the time. No further action. But they will all say they can't do anything because he's subject to police investigation. The police will throw it out because they've just been used and they know it. And any criminal accusation should only be in the criminal court. That's what it's for. So you have this theatre in the family court of what I call sham justice and bogus legality, where the accusations are often heard in the police station by a domestic violence advocate who's got a room or two in the police station. So it all dresses up as if it's proper official, with the local authority eagerly supporting and facilitating it, particularly in the poorer areas. Brent being an extreme example of that. I've far too much knowledge of their malpractice. So the criminal courts do not come into existence at all here, when there should be the first port. You should only have professional police dealing with criminal accusations. You should not have gender vigilantes with a motive of kicking fathers as hard as they can, being judge, jury, and executioner at the gateway entrance.
Vincent, in April 2013, the Legal Aid, Sentencing and Punishment of Offenders Act, affectionately known as LASPO, came into effect in England and Wales. It made the acquisition of legal aid in private family law cases dependent upon allegations of domestic abuse. Now, I don't want to ask a leading question or anything, but how stupid would you have to be to not anticipate an increase in allegations of domestic abuse would result from that? So I ask, did that happen?
Some areas of the UK had a 300% increase, and a lot of them had 82% and upwards increase in allegations of domestic abuse post-LASPO. So effectively, men became 300% more violent post-LASPO than had been pre-LASPO. All right? I mean, now, you have said, how stupid you have to be to not realize this. Reverse that question. This is exactly how it is intended to be. And for far better evidence than I can give, read the excellent book, An Exercise in Absolute Futility by Nick Langford, on dealing with this, on the composition of the panels, the Ministry of Justice, the advisory bodies, the advisory committees, and all the rest. And Rick Bradford has done an excellent piece on the woozle effect, which also neatly demonstrates the groupthink that brought this about. So there's anything but stupid. What I say is stupid is the fact, the lack of resistance. Now, obviously I'm excluding present company, right? But, and apart from a couple of handfuls outside of this trio, it is the lack of resistance, the lack of political pressure. I'm on the MOPAC in Brent, Mayor's Office, Police and Crime. That's Sadiq Khan's, used to be Boris Johnson. And it is regularly, shall we say, addressed by, let's politely call them gender vigilantes. And most of the men in that 20-odd person panel, you know what I'm talking about when they say the Churchill dog in the back of a car, you know, the dog with the nodding head. Most of the men represent the Churchill dog in the back window of a car being driven down a bumpy road. All they want to do is nod, 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 nod. Because all these panels know that if the man stands up and says anything, he's going to get the withering looks, the contemptuous comments, the withering put-downs from the aggressive women there. Half the people there are innocent, but they don't want to know what's going on. And I recently had the pleasure of getting rid of a police sergeant who addressed us for 20 minutes one night. And I thought I was listening to the Ku Klux Klan or something. And I was a black man. It is that one-sided, complete suspension of impartiality ever since Robert Peel brought up the Peelers. So I asked a few questions and she was no longer around to answer them. It hasn't been seen since. But LASPO, Legal Aid, Sentencing and Punishment of Offenders, has led to a huge increase and made it far easier to remove fathers from the family home. Many people will talk about Big Brother. It is not Big Brother. It is little sister and little brother working away together all the time, hijacking the narrative through the media, getting the control through the gateway agencies and the family courts. And once again, I say, when the average father in society is deemed an offender because of the wording, that sets the narrative from the beginning. It is, I genuinely believe that we are living at the darkest time there has been in the history of humankind for children to manage and maintain a relationship with their parents. I also deeply believe there's a huge factor in the increase in mental health issues among children. Every piece of evidence seen on this demonstrates that. But the vested interest, the anti-shared parenting lobby have the control, have the narrative, have the journalists, have the interviews. BBC, ITV, Sky will only interview them. So you have a very rigged system. And LASPO is just the driving force. It's the spearhead.
Just coming back to the details of LASPO then, under the domestic abuse gateway rule, legal aid is granted to the accuser, but not to the accused. And yet the whole concept of legal aid originally in the criminal courts was to enable the impecunious to mount a defense against an allegation. But the LASPO rules leave the accused without representation to mount a defense, despite the fact the accuser has got that representation because they've been granted legal aid. So, just to pour fuel on the fire, the new Domestic Abuse Act now even forbids a man in that position to defend himself. So am I missing something? Inversion of justice that one can think of?
Well, I want to correct one little piece of what you said there, which is that the new Domestic Abuse Act now forbids the man from defending himself. Just to clarify, and this is where the genius of the system confuses people. He is not prevented from defending himself. He is prevented from cross-examining the mother in court. He has to put the questions to the judge, and judge will then ask her the question. Now, sometimes that's not a bad idea, actually, if a father has bad English or whatever. But you have a situation where I look upon it as being the state saying, we're innocent out of this, we're the innocent party. A father can make an application to court, which costs £215, I might add, and he has all the facilities of the court available. The mother only has to get an ex parte injunction, and she has the facilities of the court available. Government sponsored. So the government is effectively saying that we have these two people who want to go to war. So all we can do is provide a medium for them to come to peace, shared parenting, moving on. What the government does not tell you is this, and what you've just asked there, Rick, demonstrates this. Parents, a pistol. Both parents have a magazine in that pistol. One magazine is loaded, the other one is empty. That is the difference. That is the comparison you need to use. It is legalized cage fighting. So since 2013, you had LASPO. 2015, you coercive and control. Practice Direction 12J brings about the restriction on fathers not being allowed to more effectively defend themselves. And I think it's Practice Direction 33, I may be wrong, that the mother can hide behind a screen. So if you're cross-examining someone, it is very important that you, and I've done it several times, that you can look at their face, their demeanor, the body language as to whether you're being effective, not effective. You deny that. So it's all this salami slicing. So at all stages, it comes in under a wonderful narrative of vulnerable women, the vulnerable mother. Consider this for a moment. About 30 years ago, when the Taliban started becoming active, shall we say, I remember seeing an interview with a cleric, a leading cleric who was advising the Taliban spiritually. And someone has asked him, why do you have to have women in, they're not allowed to give evidence in court without a man present, they can't leave the home without a man present, they can't go into proper jobs, all this excuse for discrimination. His answer was that in our interpretation, women are incomplete in faith and logic. So they need the man to give them the faith and logic to be able to properly represent themselves. Now you have the hardline feminists in this business, what I call the perversion of feminism, saying the exact same thing, that women are so weak that they must not be allowed to represent themselves in court. They must not be allowed to be cross-examined in court because they're weak. It is insane, but it's very effective at removing fathers.
Yes, indeed.
It's very effective there.
It's part of the victimhood culture, really, isn't it?
The victimhood culture has been the most greatest success they've come up with because the equality culture failed at basically the first hurdle. Once they got equal pay and all the rest in the 70s, which they should always have had, in my opinion, of course, that was only an introduction to what they wanted, which is quite straightforward supremacy, total control of the family. And I often look upon it as being like Animal Farm, But the man is like the horse. What's the horse's name in Animal Farm?
Boxer.
McGovern? Boxer, thank you. Work, 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 work. I must work harder. I must work harder. Then you die. Failure. We are just in that category now. I'm not paying, I can't complain myself in that regard, but modern men are automatically toxic masculinity and all the rest. You know, you're automatically, like it's Laspo. Men are automatically to be spat upon, dumped upon. And there's not much been done about it.
Mike.
Vincent, can you tell us about the proportion of allegations of domestic abuse that are subject to a meaningful finding of facts within the family courts?
It's a tiny proportion. And it's got to do with the genius. There's two elements of pure genius in the British family court system. I have to admire them for the wrong reasons, but I have to admire them. One is his brilliance at saying that the welfare of the child is his paramount consideration, which of course nobody can argue against that parable. It's only a phrase of convenience. That's all it is, far, far too often. Not all the time, but far too often. And two, it's absolute genius at making work for itself. But three, there's a bigger problem on the horizon that's been going for years and steadily increasing, which is the questions we've already addressed about the salami slicing and the reduction of equality and what have you, which didn't exist in the first place, really, for men. Most allegations that are brought to domestic violence agencies are eagerly assisted the victim, the survivor of domestic abuse. I love the expressions they use. Is eagerly assisted, and ex parte is usually granted. And the father gets this lengthy, copious statements later from the post, from a process server, whatever. So he's suddenly reading 40, 50 pages about himself, and he simply cannot get over the amount of allegations made against him. So if he has the wherewithal and the means to fight this, a lot of these allegations disappear like snow on a warm morning. Among the excuses you will come across is that they weren't signed, they weren't dated, they were signed in the future, which obviously you get all these pictures, all these reasons should make them invalid. Of course, the mother can say that she was stressed, she was suffering stress, hormonal, whatever excuse she wants. So if it does get to a finding of fact, most of the lurid allegations are being removed. But the finding of fact may be a year later. You may have interim contact in the meantime, under greatly reduced circumstance, supervised contact and the like. And then, this is the tragedy. Speaking from experience of findings of fact hearings myself, they are conducted quite well within the family court. Let's assume the father is cleared and he's got a hell of an avalanche to climb out from under. The problem then is that the orders after us are virtually ignored anyway by the mother, because the excuse she can then use is that it's been so long since he's been in a relation with the children now don't want to see him. A finding of fact normally takes 2 to 3 days. I know it won't take 10 days. Do not laugh. Well, it made the headlines for the wrong reasons. I know one was 8 days. By the time the judicial court, the court has sufficient time for a 3-day hearing, that's a minimum of 6 months in advance from the date being set, being looked for after directions hearings, which is after the first hearing dispute resolution appointment. So you're looking at around 3 months between each hearing. So it's a minimum a year. Now, I have known of cases that were done for 8 or 9 years with 20, 30, 40 hearings without one finding of fact hearing. Where is the logic there?
No logic at all, is there?
There is, exactly, Rick. You have it. There is no logic.
Can we turn now to parental alienation? I'm feeling the story won't be any happier there, but some people claim that parental alienation does not really exist, and it's just a ruse used by violent fathers to undermine the credibility of claims of abuse. What's your view on that position?
Sadly for my sins, I'm a bit of an expert on that. And I recently had the privilege of being interviewed by Glass Blind Spot, because parental alienation alienation has been around since the time of King Solomon and the two mothers, if anyone wants to look that up. Chuck Berry, Memphis, Tennessee, long distance information. Marie was only 6 years old. That's a song about pure parental alienation, for example. Now, I'm not saying he's a wonderful husband. I am saying he tried to be a good father to that child. Marie's only 6 years old. Information, please. I almost joke when I say that. Parental alienation has always been around, but only the more malevolent of mothers were exercising it. Since 1989, of course, they've then started increasingly having the power of the state behind them. And that greatly changed after 2013 with Lesbo. It is virtually impossible to prove because Kafkas for a long time would not accept it. They'd say you're bringing in a syndrome. So they would divert it into this syndrome, which is discredited. Now, my argument is this. If you have to make an application to court to see your children, you're already a victim, and so are the children of parental alienation. Let's have no doubt about that. All right. And then coercive controlling behavior was brought in 2015, which was the very effective means by the radical feminists and those who have a deep hatred of anything male and don't care what damage it does to children. They don't care what damage it does to mothers in society, to grandmothers, to girls, because that's half of all the children are girls. None of that is any concern to them. It should be the first concern. They're only interested in their hatred of men. And then shockingly, draft guidance on domestic violence, wanting parental alienation to be included in the coercive controlling behavior because it qualified the terms. And of course it should be there, and of course it should be illegal. But the vested interests who are so opposed to so opposed to shared parenting did not want it to be included. And I'm reluctant to use the university that it's emanated from this response, just in case I'm being sued. But suffice it to say, a group of academics got together and decided we'll create facts. That parental alienation is a term used by abusive men to get control of the children, and then, worst case scenario, subject the children to domestic abuse. To sexual abuse. Channel 4 with Candor Productions and Louis Tickle did an article on exactly this. Believe it or not, I actually am in that film, don't laugh. And they worked with an organization called The Court Said, among whom its two primary originators have done, one has done years of jail time for child abuse, extreme parental alienator, and the other one, both of them had their children taken off them, and rightly so for the grotesque abuse of the children because they didn't want the children to relation with their father. So you have a mainstream TV publication working with an agency like this. And of course, all it interviewed was barristers, the glam feminist barrister herself, Dr. Charlotte Proudman, who, listen to this, despite being a barrister, maintains under a hashtag, believe the woman. So much for due process. And she became the, and of course, certainly her experience in the family courts is that all these helpless mothers she was helping, she, despite her extraordinary ability, could not help these mothers as prevent the children being taken off them by men using parental alienation. The judges were given the children to the man automatically straight away, to the abusive male, I might add. So that is the defense against parental alienation. The most toxic abuse of the most vulnerable section of society, children, is a vehicle that must not be protected, unless it's the protection that these people wish to give it. And they have been quite effective, actually, at getting a lot of mainstream TV coverage about is parental alienation a ruse used by abusive men to get the children, because there's been a lack of opposition. I'm pleased to say that Liz Archer, who is an attachment psychologist, often works for the courts, and Sarah Filimo, of 20-odd years experience in the family courts, and my little self, were invited on Glass Blind Spot on a rebuttal of this nonsense portrayed by Dispatches Channel 4. I don't know how many millions saw Dispatches Channel 4, but probably only about 1,500 to see our rebuttal. Yeah, that is the balance we're talking about overall, whether it be LASPO, injunctions, legal aid, it's 90%, 10%.
And the specific problem with professionals like psychologists speaking out is because there is a history now of when individuals do that and poke their heads above the parapet, they get targeted. They get
Well, not alone that,
very often taken down.
Oh, absolutely. I know 3 experts in this field who will not comment publicly and it's not working because their addresses, their phone numbers, their contact information, and the names of their children.
The draft statutory guidance relating to the new Domestic Abuse Act includes parental alienation in the examples of controlling or coercive behaviour. In your opinion, Vincent, will this guidance assist courts in making better decisions in cases of parental alienation?
It could if it's in the outcome in the final piece of legislation, and if it'll be crucial in protecting children from parental alienation, but only if it's in the legislation and if it's been acted properly on, adjudicated on.
Of course, it isn't in the legislation, it's only in the guidance at present.
Correct.
And we do know there are various, domestic abuse commissioner and various different victims commissioners lobbying hard to have it removed from there.
Because they're only interested in their perceived narrative. They're so extreme that they don't care what damage it does to society, particularly to children, as long as their view is portrayed, which is a toxic gender political viewpoint.
It is indeed. If we can ask the last couple of questions now. Vincent McGovern.
Yes?
You stand accused of being a murderer of a non-existent dog. How do you plead?
Guilty by gender. Because once the Constitution and the process within Brent Domestic Violence Agency, which is a section of Women's Aid, is that they will only help female survivors of domestic abuse. I got this under FOI, Freedom of Information. And the perpetrator must not be told because the victim is in danger. And in my case, hadn't sufficient injunction against me because of the primary care of the children for over 9 years. She said this. So she's asked the leading question, which is, has he ever been known to abuse animals? So my family, with a ridiculous sense of humor they have, promptly christened this phantom dog Shadow. The Shadow came howling to the rescue, and I was processed within Brent and the MARIC process, Multiple Agency Risk Assessment Conference. Bear in mind, at this conference, I will only be told the verdict they have received, reaching the evidence in secret. That the mother could then approach the family court and get, I think, 5 orders against me, injunctions and all the rest. This is a common practice. The difference between me and an awful lot of men who are accused of equally idiotic is that I had great support from family and friends, and that enabled me, and I had the means of being able to live independently and not end up on the streets and fight this nonsense. And the courts, to their credit, threw all this nonsense out. But that took several months. So I've gratitude to the courts and for the way that they just threw aside Kafka's The Guardian motion of false allegations, including stating that the phantom dog was a typing error. 2 pages is a typing error. That is the system in the courts too often. Wow. But no, I didn't kill the phantom dog. I'm not in the spirit world yet. But I know that Del Trotter did a seance one time and charged money for it. So, you know, maybe he's up there.
Okay. And finally, Vincent, what's the most important message you'd like to leave with our audience?
The whole process in the family courts is like a house down.
So, sorry, Vincent, you froze again there. So
beg your pardon, Mike.
No, that's right. No. So if you just wait a couple of seconds and then answer.
The entire family court process, which has decent people within it, but they're a minority and a reductionist in minority, is a house of cards. And the gateway agencies are what's vulnerable to proper concerted attack. Go for the funding of the gateway agencies, many of which, in my opinion, are indulging in criminal enterprise, and there's existing legislation to deal with them effectively. If people will get organized, take them apart, and replicate the best practice as exists in first world nations. The UK is the bottom, of 37 first world nations because of these gateway agencies and the toxic male narrative. It badly needs opposition. And I thank you guys for what you're doing and giving me the opportunity to say something about it.
Thank you, Vincent.
Thanks, Rick. And thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Vincent. Very, very interesting.
It's a wrap, is it?
It's a wrap.